Welcome to Motivational Monday. This is Fred Razak, Senior Trading Strategist here at CMTrading. And today we're going to be extending from Target the Trade into Motivational Mondays, discussing Steve Jobs, connecting the dots, and persistence. Now, before we start, make sure to like, subscribe, and share so that you could get future content like this. So let's go back to 1982. My first introduction into Apple was my brother purchasing the Apple IIe computer. Now, in the next 5 to 10 years, Apple would go through a tremendous transition. And also Steve Jobs, who was one of the founders of Apple, will do so as well, as he exited the company sometimes around the end of the 80s. But the company went from the Apple IIe, which was this bulky, very heavy computer-ish kind of machine. And you know, in those days, you can't do much with it, right? You could barely play ping pong with it. And when you did type something out of it, it would be like these blocky letters. It would take forever. And you used to use this really special paper that had this, segregated holes in it on the side. And, it took a long time for it to transition into what we see PC and computers today for us to use them. I mean, it's amazing that PCs have been in the same form since then until now in the way that we have them. But as the company continued changing, it went to the Macintosh. And at a certain point, Steve Jobs was ousted from the company. And then he re-entered the surface of the company in 1997. And the company came out with its first iMac, which was a really cool design for a computer. And then it came out in 2001, I believe it was, with their MP3 players, which then developed into the iPod, and then developed into the iPhone, which developed into the iPad. And then, history just continues since then. And the iPhone kind of took off, and the company has kind of taken certain market share of different areas, but areas it believes that it could do better, more creative, more artistic, and a better product. Now, there are usually two types of people out there: Mac users and Apple users. And it's kind of funny, in the diversity in our home, who's using Mac and who's using Android, for better or worse. That's Microsoft, right? So it's kind of interesting how also Steve Jobs, if you look at his life story, which is documented in a movie really well. One of the first movies that came out on Bill Gates and Steve Jobs' lives initially in their introduction to their products into the market, and I'm specifically talking in the 70s, going into the 80s, was this movie called Pirates of Silicon Valley. And it really documents it really well in a very entertaining way. And I think that most of the adversity that and he mentions it itself also in a commencement speech in a university that Steve Jobs spoke about. He speaks about connecting the dots, where he went through different adversities in life. And he did some really random things that had nothing to do with each other. But when he came to Apple, he was able to take them all together and put it in a product that far was superior than some of its competitors in creativity and artisticness. And that, it gave him that competitive edge that seems so unlikely because it was just so random. For example, if you Google this is really important also. This is a nice tidbit. The first Macintosh had different type of fonts for the lettering. The letters that we see today, if you have Word, Microsoft Word, you see that you have a list of different type of fonts. Well, that's due to Steve Jobs, because when he was in university, he was looking at some of the courses that they gave, and he saw calligraphy, and he said, wow, that'd be really interesting. And he took calligraphy, and he learned about different type of scriptures and different types of fonts. And so when he came to Apple and they came up with the Macintosh, he said, hey, how about I use these different type of calligraphies? And all of a sudden, he had a competitive edge. That was huge. In those days, you had these very blocky, very computer-ish kind of letters or forms of letters and numbers that would appear on the screen, and he made it friendly. He made it usable, and I think that that's been Apple's main even though they don't say it, but that's been Apple's main theme, is that they want to produce products that you feel are not just a computer or a technology product, but is an extension of ourselves. And that is one of their, I think, one of their biggest competitive advantages versus everybody else. Now, in 1997, Steve Jobs did come back to the company and came out with the iMac, which then led into the MP3 player in 2001, and that evolved into the iPod, into the iPhone, and then the iPad came around, and history's just, been very gracious to them. And one of the things that stands out to me is his persistence. No matter where he was, he put himself in a very persistent environment. When he left Apple, he started, getting into animation and getting into movies that do animation. It became a whole new spectrum where it was really exciting. But that's a mindset of someone that's persistent. Now, in a persistent environment, you don't have to be consistent. That's the beauty of it, okay? And in a consistent environment, if you miss something, right? If you're committed to a diet or working out or, reading a certain amount, and you miss that one day, well, what happens? It's gone. You feel like a failure because you haven't been consistent on it. But if you're committing to a persistent environment, you could say, hey, I'm pushing ahead no matter what. Even if I have setbacks, I'm still pushing ahead. And that is probably the story to Apple, going from their almost negative. I mean, in 2002, 2003, if you look at a chart, their price is at negative. I mean, and it went all the way up to about $500. If you take in the 5-for-1 stock split, and it's now $2,000, so it's probably about $1,000 to $2,000, somewhere in that range. That's an amazing success story for someone who just was persistent. Now, these success stories and these type of people, obviously like Elon Musk or like Steve Jobs or like Bill Gates, who are persistent, keep at it. They don't get discouraged. And most of us, unfortunately, we get discouraged sometime along that journey, and we don't get to go see the end picture. I mean, there's a really great book by Napoleon Hill where he mentions someone who just stopped short of about 5 feet of gold. And he was digging, but he ran out of money and he ran out of willpower. And because he ran out of all that stuff, he had to sell all the machinery. And somebody else bought that machinery and said, this guy must have been up to something. And he continued and he picked up where this guy stopped digging for gold, and he got to the gold. Now, this other guy who sold the business ended up going to the insurance business and doing well for himself. But the point is that don't stop short at 70%. Make sure you follow through to 100%. And no matter what you do, as long as you're following through, even if you don't get the gold, you become someone in that journey of going to the gold, that you become golden yourself. I think that's a great message for our Motivational Mondays. Wishing you a great week. We'll see you here next week. Thank you.